So, the college baseball season is about to get underway, and it's time for a little preseason ranked.
The Bash Bros are back, ladies and gentlemen.
At the number one spot. Can I hear a drum roll, please? We could also put that in post, but it's fine. We can also. Oh, Kevin, who do you have?
Tennessee!
Tennessee, come on down. That is not who I have. I got a good little LSU, but apparently a little birdie told me that their best pitcher got injured a few days ago. So,
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the benefit of doing your rankings late, right before the season starts. You get these key injuries in here. LSU, Grant Taylor, supposed to be one of the headline starting pitchers this season, is out for the year, which leaves them with no talent on that roster whatsoever. So we're putting Tennessee at 1. They have Chase Dolander leading the squad. Bunch of heavy hitters. Just clearly better.
oh, for sure. Definitely. It's not like they have a bunch of transfers at LSU coming in that could easily overcome that little injury. But, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, they have two of the best transfer pitchers, if not three, because we got Paul Skeens, Thatcher Hurd, and Christian Little all in this potentially dynamic pitching force out here. Looks like Christian Little will probably be the closer, and I mean, apparently they lost their best pitcher, but it's tough to say with Paul Skeens coming in. I mean, he was amazing at Air Force. He can do a little bit with the bat as well, so we'll see if that comes out at all, but it might not even have to with the lineup they have in. But I guess we're going to go with Tennessee at number 1. Right now, it's really just a complete crapshoot, and that's kind of what all preseason rankings are. I mean, you got to take everything with a grain of salt here. But it does seem like there is a pretty clear 1 and 2, or at least clear 2 best teams. It's tough to say which one's 1, which one's 2, but it seems like Tennessee and LSU are those teams to beat.
Yeah, certainly a 1A, 1B type of situation here. And I think we're just going to go with Tennessee. They're in the bad boys role, the villains from last year. Nobody wants to see them win once again. I certainly don't. You either love them or you hate them. And here at this end of Bash Bros, we hate them.
Hey, you love to hate them, right? And you never want to be a team where people are indifferent about you. You want to evoke emotion, and that's what Tennessee does. So whether you love them or you love to hate them, that's what they want. With Tennessee, it really is just like their stacked pitching staff. They still have a decent offense. They lost a few pretty big staples in their offense, but pitching staff is all still there, so it's just going to be tough to beat them on a weekend series. You might be able to scrape a few games off midweek just because their offense is a little bit worse and they won't have those dynamic starting pitchers, but it seems like they just have a team to easily sweep weekends.
Yep, especially with that starting rotation, like you mentioned. You got Chase Dolander, who is going to be in the running for pitcher of the year in the entire country, followed up by Chase Burns and Drew Beam. I mean, you're not going to see this weekend rotation much better than that, if at all. And then on the offensive side, you mentioned they lost some bats, but they also brought a couple in, specifically Maui Ahuna, I believe is how you say it, from Kansas, was one of the best transfers available in the portal. Hit 396 last year at Kansas. Looks to just be a lethal weapon in that offense.
Yeah, it really seems like Tennessee and LSU just scooped up all the best transfers like right off the bat. There was just no chance for anybody else, really.
Yep, the South continues to rule the baseball world.
Yep. All right, let's move on to the third spot. It feels like a lot of places have Stanford as the consensus 3 overall. What's your thoughts on this?
Here, a team that is just a few spots lower in a bunch of the national rankings, but I bumped them up to this 3 spot, is Wake Forest. Led by Rhett Lauder on the mound, is one of those guys who could give Chase Dolander a run for his money for National Pitcher of the Year. He won ACC Pitcher of the Year last season and is going to continue to dominate again. Wake Forest is one of those programs that's never really put it all together in recent memories, but they do have some weapons on the offensive end, led by Nick Kurtz, the first baseman, who hit 338 with 15 bombs last season. He's going to be leading the way, potential All-American there, and this team's certainly looking dangerous.
Yeah, that was definitely a team that I was thinking about putting that high. But looking at just other rankings, it doesn't seem like they are as convinced of Wake Forest. But just looking at their roster, their top end talent is very good, and they have a lot of upperclassmen. So they could definitely put something together here, and I think they could definitely stay in that number 3 spot. So yeah, we can leave it there. And at number 4, I mean, I think Stanford, they have a lot of talent, a lot of experience. They did lose some of their top players, but as we saw last year, those guys didn't have the best seasons and when were kind of inconsistent, and they were kind of rooted by this just overall talented group that most of these players are still here.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I had them at 5 in my rankings, but I'm good with having them up in this area. Like you mentioned, lose 2 of their best players. That is hard to overcome, but like you said, they are extremely talented throughout the lineup. Still have some massive pieces left in there with Carter Graham, Tommy Troy, Drew Bowser, and Braden Montgomery, all who are going to be vying for all conference spots and potentially all American spots.
Okay, so moving on to the number 5 spot. What are you thinking here?
Currently, I have the Arkansas Razorbacks coming in here at 5. Just a program that continues to impress year over year at staying at the top. This is another year where they lost a decent amount of pieces from last season, but at this point, just putting faith in the coaching staff, faith in the organization altogether, and they are led by Peyton Stovall, who's going to be arguably one of the best players in the country, and so sticking them up here.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I had them a bit further down, but I think there is kind of a gap after that, like 4 spot. There are options for what team you want to put there, and a lot of those teams are SEC, so it really just is kind of a TBD of which teams will come out on top there. But Arkansas is definitely be one of those potential teams. I think it's going to be tough to go through the start of the season after they lost both Jalen Battles and Robert Moore through the draft, and so I think they kind of do need to figure out themselves. They might have, but there is definitely that leadership gap that was there after those 2 players left, and it seems like they could have filled those spots. I mean, with Stovall especially, and they got some good transfers in. But yeah, I mean, both offense and pitching seem to be pretty good. But it's tough to know which SEC team at this rank will be the top. I mean, there's like Florida, Texas A&M. You could say Vandy's also in that bucket. Ole Miss, bunch of these teams that are right there, and it's just which team comes out on top in the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, in these preseason rankings, it's really hard to know at this point. Besides these top couple teams, you really don't know. People are going to have to step up on certain teams. All of these top 25 teams are extremely talented, and it's just a matter of which players step up and what team's playing right at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, last year I think a lot of preseason polls had LSU in the top 5, and they've had a tough time staying in the top 25. They were up and down at the back end of the top 25 the entire year. And I know other teams also struggled, and Stanford was another one of those teams that was like consensus top 5 team, and right off the bat they dropped almost out of the top 25 as well. So it was definitely hard to tell, especially at the beginning of the year when teams are still trying to find out their identity, to really rank these teams. Besides the top dogs that have a lot of guys back and have shown that they've are contenders for the national championship like the previous year.
And then even if you add on the top end, I still don't believe there's been a single team who has been preseason ranked number 1 and stayed 1 throughout the entire season. So at some point during the season, both LSU and Tennessee are going to struggle, potentially lose a series, flip-flop. Maybe someone else jumps them. So, I mean, it's just hard to tell at this point.
Yeah. All right. So what are we thinking for this 5 spot? Are we going to say Arkansas?
Sure.
I mean, I think they have the makeup for it. They have that top end talent, but it's just tough to know with
the next ones
with some of our big guys.
Texas A&M and Ole Miss.
Okay, I have Texas A&M in my 5 spot, but Yeah, we can discuss that. I think Texas A&M, they bring back a ton of talent for in their offense. They're bringing back a lot of players, and they weren't a power team unlike a lot of SEC schools that you see are just all home runs. But they had just a bunch of contact guys that hit over 300 and just could get on base and be a nuisance. And they bring back a lot of those guys. So they were a team last year that nobody really expected to be in the conversation for one of the best teams in the nation, and they proved everybody wrong, and they can just ride that wave this year. So I think they definitely deserve a nod to be a top five team.
Yeah, and it's another one of those programs with a fabulous coaching staff and just a good program altogether. So even when you have some turnover in the lineup, it's not hard for them to stay on top. And I think we'll see that again with Texas A&M this year, staying in the top of these rankings.
Do you want to shoot them at 5 and then Arkansas at 6?
Sure.
And it's just all SEC teams from here on out. After that, I have Ole Miss up there. I think you can't really look past them as the national champions. You can't really drop them too far back down. They did lose some really amazing players, and their pitching seems a bit iffy this year. They kind of have to solidify that. But they got top end guys on offense, and you can't look past that. And they won the Natty, so they're going to be looking for more.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned with Ole Miss, they do return quite a bit of that offense, lost a couple guys, but team that just played extremely well once the postseason came. Nobody really thought they belonged in the tournament to begin with, but then they go on to win it all. And then, like you mentioned, definitely some question marks on the pitching staff. But if Hunter Elliott performs the way he did in the postseason and in the College World Series, they are certainly in good hands, at least for Friday nights. And then from there, it's going to need a high schooler or a transfer player to step up.
Do we think Ole Miss deserves that spot? Do you have any other teams that you think could fit in there?
I like Ole Miss there.
Cool. Ole Miss at 7. All right. Number 8. What are we thinking? I still have like Florida up there. They have had their tough goings recently. It seems like every postseason they struggle, but they still always have a talented roster, and it seems like they got good pitching and a solid offense again this year. But with SEC, with this many SEC teams in the top 10, it's gonna be tough.
Yeah, other than them, I was also looking at Louisville in this spot. They have quite a few guys that just hit for an insanely high average. Another one of those teams that talking about earlier that didn't hit for a lot of power, but just had guys that continue to get on base, and they have some really high-end talent in this lineup, followed by a good pitching staff as well. And I think these guys are definitely going to be looking to host a regional at minimum and potentially a super again.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think the rankings get really difficult, where you could pretty much throw any team name out there that is like shown up somewhere in a ranking wherever and make a case for them, where they have like some good, some bad, and you're just like, let's see if this one sticks here, because I have Louisville like at like 15, but who knows where they're actually gonna land. I mean, I don't know. You could make a case for like any team.
I want to believe in Florida's talent as well, but the last two postseasons have really just turned me off from ranking them highly. It's just
Yeah, that
hard.
makes sense. That makes complete sense.
The regular season performance is there, but the performance in the postseason hasn't been.
Yeah. So it looks like for Louisville, they have a lot of good guys coming back on offense for sure that have pretty damn good numbers, and then pitching looks decent. So we can put them up there. We'll shoot them up to number 8. Why not get another ACC team in there? Also, another team to consider around this spot is like Oklahoma State. Seems like they look like they could be decent this year. Get a Big 12 team up that high.
Yep, they were next on my list as well. Just another great program altogether. They got quite a few returners in that lineup. I think like 6 of the 9 guys are returners or something like that. Going to be a talented lineup once again. It looks like the pitching staff got some good transfers in, so I think that starting rotation will be viable, especially with Jerron Watts-Brown from Long Beach State. Completely dominated there last year. We'll see how he does in the Big 12. A little more talent, but I think he'll hold up well.
Yeah, I think the offense is there's no questions really there. It's really all behind the pitching staff with like looks like their top two guys coming in being transfers and then the other people not playing at the D1 level last year. So it's tough to really say if their pitching can be decent. I think they've a really good shot to be a good team, but I think they should just ride their offense and see where that takes them. But yeah, I think 9 we can slot them in at 9. Why not? And then 10 we still have Florida. We still have Florida lingering around. I know Vandy, and then there are the other teams coming into this spot that could potentially take it, like an East Carolina or maybe another Pac-12 team. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like sticking Florida here. I think they're in a pretty similar spot with Vandy as far as the talent pool on both teams. So I think they would both be pretty interchangeable in this spot as far as both returning a good amount of talent, should be decent squads, and certainly both have some question marks. Vandy more on the mound, I would say, after losing out some transfers. It's really just Carter Holton holding it down from last year. Other than that, a lot of question marks for them on the pitching staff. The lineup should be good, though. I mean, hard to not be good when you have Enrique Bradfield Jr. in there, just stealing every base possible. But
Yeah, I do think they have it seems like a lot of sophomores that are gonna come into the lineup that didn't play that much last year, so it should be interesting to see how that pans out. I mean, but Vandy, you're getting the top tier talent every year, year in year out. So these guys should be good enough to play in the SEC, but it's always tough to know how good they'll come in from the jump. So I think that inexperience might be a detriment to them at the beginning of the year, maybe the beginning of conference play. So I do like Florida a little bit above them, but I could see Vandy around that area too.
say we stick Florida right ahead of them then.
Cool. All right. So Florida, Vandy as 10 and 11. And then at 12, 13, 14, 15, we got teams like East Carolina, Maryland, UCLA, maybe North Carolina. And so you got Miami also potentially. A lot of teams that you could consider at this spot.
Yeah, two of those I have a ways down further, but certainly could be
What two?
East Carolina and Miami.
Interesting. I have Miami down further, but I have East Carolina pretty high. They're in a conference where they can usually do pretty well, so I think that always helps with maintaining a high rank like that. I think they got decent players back. Their pitching staff looks decent. Maybe their offense is a bit worse than last year, but pitching probably should be better, so I think it kind of balances out there.
Yeah, no, I think they're certainly viable, and like you said, playing in a weaker conference, they're gonna stay on top, probably dominate the conference, and just rack up the wins in the regular season. So I do think it's a viable ranking. In mine, I had North Carolina.
Okay.
Yeah, I just think they have the high end talent, especially with Vance Honeycutt leading the way. I think he's going to be a Golden Spikes Award finalist potentially. Just performed extremely well last year, and I think that lineup is pretty stacked heading into the season.
Yeah, I agree with you there with the top end talent. You can't really overlook that there. Also with Max Carlson, their ace, seems like he's the real deal and will really show up. But they do have some question marks with the rest of their team. They don't have the most depth. But I think that's kind of what you'll see at around this rank. They have a few of these clear dudes, but maybe the other guys around them aren't as experienced or just aren't as talented overall. But yeah, this is definitely a team that could be around that 12 to 15 spot for sure. Okay, we can put them at 12. I do think we should mention, what are your thoughts on a Maryland or UCLA around this area?
Yep, I had UCLA at 14 and then Maryland at 15.
Okay, so what do you have at 13?
I had Virginia Tech.
With Virginia Tech, they bring back a lot of solid guys. It seemed like everybody on their roster last year had 12 to 15 home runs. They lose a few of those guys, but a decent number of them are coming back, and seems like they still have a pretty decent squad, so they definitely could be in that top 15 area.
Yeah, a lot of decent amount of people returning, and then a couple mid-major talents transferring in as well. Yeah, no, I think it's one of those lineups that you're going to see perform especially well earlier in the season, just because it's a lot of returners, guys with experience from past season. So I think they're going to be clicking right off the rip.
Yeah, for sure. I also want to mention UCLA. The pitching will always be good, no matter what. Seems like they're going to be like the top one or two pitching teams in the Pac-12. And they always bring in those top talented players like you see in the SEC. I mean, some of them happen to transfer there, but they always bring in those freshman top tier recruits. And a lot of those guys, they had a pretty good recruiting class last year. A lot of them are like sophomores coming into that next year. The offense should definitely be better. So I think they could be in that like 13 spot.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that take on them there. Whereas last year it was a young team and they were still talented and still good, but they were a young team. You give everyone another off season of development, a year under their belt. They do lose Thatcher Hurd in the transfer portal, but other than that, this team is looking very solid with more experience at this point and probably going to be playing at a higher level than last season.
Sweet. So UCLA in that 13 spot. And then 14, I know we mentioned Maryland earlier. Seems like there's just never much mention of Big 10 teams, but Maryland looks to be the one team that could make it into that like top 10 potential ranking further in the future, but they have that experience. Their pitching depth got better to complement their top starters like they had last year, so that should definitely be beneficial. And they looked like a just decent squad all around.
Yeah, they didn't lose a whole lot in that lineup either. A lot of returners who dominated in the Big Ten last year. I'd expect them to do it again. Just in all honesty, it's a weak conference, and so they're going to dominate and probably win that conference with ease.
Sweet. Do you want to stick them at 14 then?
Sounds good.
All right. And we mentioned them earlier that we would potentially be dropping them farther than I had them, but East Carolina still on the board. We can slip them in somewhere right here, like around this spot. Do have like the Virginia Tech, TCU, Virginia teams around here. I think especially Virginia, their offense is going to be potentially one of the best in the nation, but pitching has a lot of question marks. There's just a lot of innings up for grab with that team, but the offense just looks absolutely stacked.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned with Virginia, the offense is absolutely stacked. And yeah, there are some question marks on the pitching staff. I do think it'll be viable though. And yeah, it's another team we could be sticking up here for sure.
Cool. Any other teams you want to mention before we get into the weeds of things?
I say the only other team right now before we kind of hit this next break off before like a little drop, I would say is Southern Miss.
Yeah, I have Southern Miss around the same area. I don't know. It seems like the hitters essentially all returned, so their offense is going to be very similar and probably better than last year, but their pitching staff has just been absolutely demolished. They only have their ace pitcher back, which I guess is the one you want back if you had to choose one, but that's it pretty much.
Yeah, certainly. But yeah, I mean, having that ace back certainly helps. Tanner Hall was one of the best pitchers in the entire country last year. And like you mentioned, returning most of their lineup back, they're in Conference USA, which is actually a very solid baseball conference. But I think these guys will find themselves on top of this conference at the end of the year once again. They dominated a lot of last season, just winning every series pretty much. And I think they're going to find themselves in a similar position as long as they figure out the back end of that starting rotation.
And another team around this spot would be TCU. They're experienced. They have a lot of juniors like that should be in their starting lineup. So they should be better than last year in most places. And they could definitely be competing for the Big 12 title.
Yeah, no, TCU is definitely viable in this spot. Uh, yeah, returning a lot of talent on the offensive side of things. And their pitchers were good last year. Not incredible, but I think they will be able to eat up innings, and that offense, I think, will carry this team throughout most of that Big 12 season.
All right, so let's go with Virginia Tech at that 15 spot. We talked about them a few minutes ago, and I think they deserve it with the offense that they're bringing back.
Yep, feel comfortable slotting them in there. Definitely a talented squad.
Okay, at 16, we still have the same teams. I think TCU is definitely an option. We got East Carolina, Virginia also around there.
I'd say let's go with East Carolina here.
Cool. East Carolina in the building. Represent. Can they make it to a College World Series?
We'd love to see it. We're supportive of the mid majors.
Of course. All right. I like either TCU or Virginia in this next spot. I think both of them have their merits, with TCU just having an overall experienced squad and Virginia having an insanely dynamic offense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like these three feel like we go TCU, Virginia, Southern Miss.
Yep. I like it. TCU, Virginia, Southern Miss. Lovely. All right, and now we finally broke to new territory where we get to teams where we haven't really talked about. In these next spots, I think Miami deserves a shout. I know a lot of rankings have them a lot higher, but it seems like they will have a top offense, but not really sure about how deep the team is, and the pitching also seems a bit iffy. So it seems like they're just a worse version of Virginia. Virginia's just absolutely potent offense and kind of similar with Virginia Tech.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think they're struggling on the pitching end heading into this season. Besides Andrew Walters, who is just probably the best reliever in the country. Outside of that, they're struggling on the starting side of things and in the middle there. But yeah, certainly viable for this spot, like you mentioned, higher in other rankings, but just a bit unsure altogether on what they're going to be looking like.
Cool. Any other teams you want to mention around this spot? For me, potentially like Oregon, Alabama, NC State, those kind of teams. I'm not sure what teams you have at the back end of your rankings, but
Yeah. I'd say other consideration for the spot, I would have Oregon as well as Texas Tech and NC State potentially.
I was looking at Texas Tech. I just think there's so many question marks there. Obviously, they're like a top tier program. They always seem to be in it, but they're only bringing back a few good offensive players from last year, and their pitching staff has question marks. And like we've seen with teams like right above where we're ranking, they just have really good offenses or bringing back a lot of players, and maybe they have marks on the pitching staff. But the offense looks really solid, and I don't know if I necessarily see that with Texas Tech. I think Oregon is another good example of a team that looks like they'll have a relatively good offense, but a lot of question marks on the pitching staff. So yeah,
And I'm fine with dropping Texas Tech out of this spot as well because they did have a couple injuries come up a couple days ago that
yeah,
I
that
did not
did
take into
happen.
consideration. Didn't adjust my rankings yet, but yeah, I'd
Cool.
be fine with
All
them.
right. So, I mean, we could also talk about like NC State. They lost one of the best players in the nation through the transfer portal, Tommy White, but the offense still looks like it should be pretty good. It's bringing back a decent number of players. Pitching also, like many other teams around this area, has their question marks. If Highfill can come back and fill the potential that he has shown, then this team could definitely be higher in the rankings. But that's kind of hard to tell at this point.
Yeah, I would say the good thing about this pitching staff, at least, is they quite a few of them did have a large amount of innings last year, so at least they're experienced. They might not have performed as well as you'd hope for a top 25 team necessarily, but they do have some experience in these starting roles. Got one of the better left-handed transfers in Rio Britton from Oregon, and so we'll see how they do all together.
Yep. So what are we thinking? We got Miami, Oregon, potentially NC State. We took out Texas Tech out of this quick conversation, but I think those are three teams that could definitely be further up in the top 25 if they get things going. But like we said, pitching is the question marks, and offense seems like they have some consistency in.
I say we go with that order you just said: Miami, Oregon, NC State.
Cool. Miami, Oregon, NC State it is. Next few teams. We mentioned Texas Tech, so I think they're still could be in this conversation. There are a few SEC teams that could be at the back end of the top 25, and also in-state rivals. Oregon State for Oregon, they definitely could make their way into the top 25 preseason rankings. We could start with Alabama. Looks like they're bringing back a lot of returning players, so they should improve. And if they do, they could be dangerous in the SEC. But it's a lot of ifs, and there's just so many good teams in the SEC that they will have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, I agree with that there from Alabama. Like you said, returning a good amount, but they are in a tough conference and it's going to be tough to compete, especially with the top end teams in there. It's going to be hard to avoid getting swept by teams like that. And, but other than that, I do have Oregon State in there as well. Certainly some question marks throughout that team. They lost their best player on the offensive side and on the pitching staff. So there are some gaping holes for them to fill. But it's just another one of those teams that you just kind of give the benefit of the doubt, just given the program's reputation. You kind of got to give faith in Mitch Canham to figure it out, put something together, and make them viable contenders in the conference.
Yeah, and they have had relatively good recruiting classes year in, year out, so you expect their talent pool to be able to be replenished, and they definitely deserve a shout to be in the top 25, even if there are those glaring question marks with their top players leaving. Another team that we could mention in this area is another SEC team, South Carolina. I think even though they had a bad year last year, they have the potential to be a decent team in the SEC. They have top end pitching and seems like they could have a decent offense, but a lot of transfers, so it will be interesting to see how everything gels out there.
These end of the rankings are extremely difficult with, do you go with some lower end teams or like mid to lower end teams in these power conferences, or do you try and stick some pretty talented mid majors in here? It's kind of just pick your poison. Some of them are going to pan out, maybe be ranked higher in the rankings at the end of the year. Some of them are going to be not relevant and probably not make the tournament.
Yeah, for sure. It's just even more of a crapshoot the further down in the rankings you go. Like, who knows if any of these teams will even be making the tournament, like you said. But any thoughts for these last three spots? Any other teams you want to mention, or should we just figure out the order to get this wrapped up?
I think we've mentioned most of the ones that I would consider at this point.
So, what teams? We got Alabama, South Carolina, Texas Tech, Oregon State. 4 teams, 3 slots. We could mention, like, I don't know, mid-major teams like UCSB. Seems like they're going to be the powerhouse of their conference and probably win it there, but
I'd probably go Alabama, Oregon State, Texas Tech.
okay, we can do that. That's fine by me.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, 3 teams with some high-end potential, but at the same time, if things don't go right, you could see them not making the tournament as well.
All right, so that's our rankings wrapped up. Let's do a quick little rundown. So our top 25 preseason rankings are Tennessee number 1, LSU at 2, Wake Forest, Stanford, Texas A&M, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Louisville, Oklahoma State, and Florida wrapping out the top 10. Vandy, North Carolina, UCLA, Maryland, Virginia Tech, East Carolina, TCU, Virginia, Southern Miss, Miami, Oregon, NC State, Alabama, Oregon State, and Texas Tech to round out the top 25. We will see if any of these teams make the tournament, but this is what we have to start the season off.